In this video, we are going to talk about Gable Truss stud layout. My name is Chad Johnson. I've been in the roof truss industry for over 30 years, and I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. Let's start out with what is a gable truss. So on a typical rectangular building, you're going to have two ends with siding on them and two sides that have a gutter on them. These ends with the siding are gables. And these trusses are typically constructed of a bunch of vertical members to allow the siding to attach and continue that straight face up from the side of the building. And so that's where the stud spacing comes into effect. Some considerations that are not aesthetic are based on adequate attachment of the siding material to the gable so that the siding material will perform properly and also to carry the snow loads. We're not going to talk about that though, because that is something that your truss manufacturer will take into account when they are designing the truss to meet the local codes and loading requirements. Okay, so why would the stud spacing on your gable matter? And that depends. So typical spacing is 16 or 24 inches on center, and that is based primarily on the fact that it divides nicely into 4-foot long or 8-foot long sheets of material, such as plywood or OSB. A typical layout would be from the center out, where you would have a stud in the very center of the truss, and then you'd have another stud every 16 or 24 inches on center going out from the center. That's very efficient for the truss manufacturer because it has multiple studs, at least two in each truss that are the same length. That makes cutting easy. And if you're doing siding such as a lap siding or a stucco or brick or something like that, it really doesn't matter if the studs align with what's below. And so starting in the center is an easy way to go. So the simplest is the stud right in the center. Now, why might we want to do it a different way? Well, one reason would be if you are doing a vent in the center of the truss. It's very typical to put a vent in the center and then start the stud spacing on each side of that. So maybe it's a 12-inch wide vent, and then the trusses would, or the studs would go 16 inches on a center going out from that vent, and that keeps it symmetrical. That's one reason why the studs might not just start in the center. Another potential layout would be starting in the center or offset, but either way, in order to get a board and batten look, for instance. So that in that case, the studs would be spaced depending on the spacing that you want for the batten. So they might be 16 inches on center, they might be 12 inches on center, they might be 24 inches on center, but in that case, the stud layout isn't based on what works the best for the sheathing. Instead, it's for what works best for the batten. There are some instances where you wouldn't want to start in the center of the truss, but instead you might want to start at one end. And a good regular reason for that would be something like T111 siding. So T111 siding comes in 4-foot widths with grooves that are at 4-inch, 8-inch, 12-inch spacing, depending on the T111 itself. And that T111 typically is laid out on the building from one end and then across the truss or across the wall. And so in order to get those grooves to line up from the lower portion to the upper portion, we want to make sure that the studs in the gable truss align with the studs in the wall below. And so sometimes you may not have a stud that lands in the center of the truss. It may land a little bit offset. And in that case, you would want to make sure that your stud layout matches the studs below rather than from the center out or from one end in. And that way your siding stays consistent all the way across. So to recap, gable stud spacing is by default typically from the center of the truss out, but it can be a detail that is overlooked depending on the type of siding that you intend on putting on the house and on the gable. So it's a good conversation to bring up with your builder and with your truss manufacturer. If the gable studs don't line up exactly with what the intention was or the framing below, it's not a big deal because it's easy to add studs into a truss, but why not get it right in the first place? And especially if you have any questions, give your truss manufacturer a call. They're happy to make accommodations, have a conversation, and make sure to get it right the first time. I hope you like this video. If you'd like to learn more about roof trusses in general, here's a link to our roof truss basics video. And if you'd like to learn about floor trusses, here's a link to our floor truss video. Have a great day.